Judith. Nice to see you.
Very nice to meet you.
Must be Andrew.
Yes,
Very
nice to meet you.
Very
Thank
good
you
to
so
see
much.
you.
Pleasure.
It's a pleasure.
Eyes this way then, everybody. They've all gone quiet behind us. Right, here we go. That's it.
Sir John, ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, it's a real immense pleasure to welcome you to the University of South Wales on this November evening to what promises to be a memorable event in the university calendar. It's truly fantastic to see so many of our business partners, council leaders, local schools, staff and students represented in the audience this evening. In recent years, we have been privileged to welcome many highly distinguished speakers to our campuses, although arguably none more distinguished than tonight's speaker, the Right Honourable Sir John Major. A former British Prime Minister, Sir John's eminent career has taken him to the very top of the world of politics, and his story is inspirational to any young and aspiring politicians here today, and I was privileged to witness some of those conversations earlier this afternoon. As a university, University of South Wales is all about ensuring that our graduates are prepared for the world of work and for the increasingly demanding workplaces that they choose to enter. We support our students to become highly employable, creative and culturally rich graduates with the skills to find employment that will enable them to be an agenda for positive change in the world. None epitomises this more than our Global Choices lecture series, of which tonight forms part and is just one vehicle through which our students and the wider university community can access intellectual thinking and form new opinions on today's global challenges. The university itself enjoys a rich seam of policy knowledge and expertise drawn on by government, public and private sectors to underpin decisions on the major issues facing our society and economy. Our internationally renowned experts in governmental leadership, health and social care policy, economic growth, future skills, all work together to provide public policy analysis equal to the very best in the United Kingdom. I have for some time been looking forward to, as I'm sure all of you have, Sir John's lecture this evening, and notably his views on the changing world in which we live, the run-up to Brexit and what the future has in store. And on that note, I'm really delighted to hand over to Dr. Andy Thompson, who leads the Global Choices lecture series here at USW, who will start this evening's proceedings. Thank you very much.
I'll keep my comments very brief. And my thanks too for you all making the time to be here this evening. Sir John Major entered Parliament in 1979 and then government in 1983. He joined the Cabinet as Chief Secretary to the Treasury in 1987 before being appointed Secretary of State for Foreign and Commonwealth Affairs in July of 1989 and then Chancellor of the Exchequer in October of the same year. Sir John served as Prime Minister from 1990 through to 1997, during which time, of course, he led the negotiations in Maastricht, which culminated in the Treaty on European Union. Sir John retired from the House of Commons at the general election in 2001. Among other roles, he is a senior advisor to Credit Suisse, he is chair of the campaign board of King's London, and he is the president or patron of numerous UK and international charities. Sir John played a leading role in bringing about a lasting peace settlement in my home country of Northern Ireland. It's a place which, in its preoccupation with the past, led one historian to say that it was like Dracula's Transylvania, much troubled by the undead. On a personal note, therefore, it is a great pleasure to welcome to the university this evening someone who did so much to lay those lingering ghosts to rest. Staff, students and guests, Sir John Major.
Well, Andrew, thank you very much, and good evening, everyone. 25 years ago, I was walking in the Kremlin garden with Boris Yeltsin. And I said to him, Boris, tell me, in one word, what is the state of Russia? He said, good. I was surprised it was falling to pieces. I said, tell me in 2 words. He said, not good. And it occurs to me our world is very much like that at the present time. Now, I'm delighted to be here in Wales this evening to talk about change and some, obviously not all, but some of the challenges of tomorrow. Now, a few hours ago, the Cabinet began studying a draft withdrawal deal to leave Europe. And I promise I will turn to that later. But first, I'd like to range a little more widely. Wherever one looks around the world, there's a new world forming. It's vigorous. It's often contemptuous of old thinking. For a long time, democracy, the spread of liberal politics and free trade seemed to be unstoppable. We now know that they were not. Democracy hasn't just plateaued. It is, in fact, in modest retreat. Many democracies have relapsed over the first 2 decades of this century, and there is widespread dissatisfaction in many others. The United Nations reports that in 2016, the last year for which we have figures, over 60 countries saw a decline in civil and political liberties, while only half that number had gains. And that trend appears to be continuing. Now, this suggests that the arguments we believed had comprehensively been won about democracy and the rule of law, about a liberal system of government, about free trade, need to be fought and won once again. And there are no limits to change. That's true of politics and true of the world structure of power. It's true of how we live now and how we will live in the future. It's true of health and the world of work. Globalization, science, medicine, technology, and public expectations all drive increasingly rapid change. Now, few things in life are certain, but we can be sure that today's young people will live in a very different world from previous generations. And much of that's good. The world, when you look at it as a whole, the world is a far better place than once it was. The young will see things, do things, know things of which their forebears never dreamed. But they'll also face new challenges in their own lives and more widely. In the UK, the young will face high rents, the rising cost of houses and student loans, and the need for lifetime pension savings, the latter 2 of which were not faced by earlier generations who lived in more settled times. And precisely because of the scale of change, I would like to say something first directly to the young people who are here this evening. This is your world. You and your generation can help shape it. Your lease on life is self-evidently longer than that of your elders. So try and shape a tomorrow of which you can be proud. You have both a right and a duty to make your voice heard. Because the young are literally tomorrow. So I invite you to lift your eyes not only to the problems of your own country, but to the wider world, to climate change, to hunger, to disparity of wealth, to poverty, to any actions wherever they may be that challenge civilized government. Now, as is self-evident, I am no longer young. But I do remember how I felt when I was. I can still remember the optimism and the idealism that as you get older, life has a habit of squeezing out of you. At 20, you feel a sense of injustice. At 30 to 40, career and family begin to distract you. And by the age of 50 to 70, grandchildren and the problems of aging add to your many preoccupations. So it's no wonder that minds begin to be focused on the personal rather than the wider interest. But it need not be so. And it would be better if it wasn't so. Because the world that you build throughout your life will be the world your family inherits. So whether you're young or middle-aged or old, you should speak out and vote to protect the way in which we live and think and act. And I say that because it has rarely been more important than now. And let me tell you why. Because much of the world is narrowing its focus. Internationalism, cooperation with and the understanding of others and their problems is becoming unfashionable. And intolerant nationalism is on the march. It's raising its ugly head. The art of compromise, consensus politics, is condemned by many as weak, while more robust, more extreme politics is attracting popular support. Capitalizing on discontent, the very worst sort of populism is thriving. So-called strong men rise to power, or if not power, influence, by preaching self-interest and promising national well-being with no policies likely to achieve it. But their idea of well-being is often at the expense of minorities who may not be able to protect themselves. And the risk is clear. It's that the international values-based system that we have lived under is under threat. A selfish form of nationalism is on the march. A trend that proclaims, forget shared values, it's time for self-interest, is a hazardous route of travel. And even in our own country, the most mature democracy in the world, even in our own country, that trend is evident. It manifests itself in xenophobia. It's anti-foreigner, anti-immigrant, anti-Europe. It's careless of the misfortune of others. It opposes overseas aid. It lacks human empathy or compassion. And the drumbeat of its motto is self, self, self. There is a better way to go. After the last World War, the post-war generation faced the most daunting challenges, but led by the United States, rose collectively to meet them. World leaders worked together across national boundaries and beyond national self-interest to build alliances and structures to oppose communism, to protect and build democracy, to promote rules-based global trade, and as far as possible, to secure long-term peace. And out of the rubble of 1945, a new world was built on shared values and on communal interest. Nationalism was defeated and replaced by international cooperation. But this laudable achievement is currently being eroded at the very moment that it needs to be refreshed. The post-war settlement, the UN and all the other institutions set up in the late 1940s. The post-war settlement needs updating, but there's little chance at the moment of that happening. And at the same time, autocracy is thriving in Russia, in China, in Turkey, in Iran, in Hungary, and advancing in many other countries. Far-right groups are growing right across Europe, including in our own country. The concept of crude, intolerant populism finds an echo in many countries. Even in the United States, the nation after the war, which helped finance the rebirth of war-torn Europe with the Marshall Plan, the nation that was the guiding hand behind the foundations of the post-war institutions, the nation which, against her own public opinion, had a president, President Truman, who kept troops in Europe to protect the peace of Europe. Even that country now advances under the slogan of America First. So America, for so long our most powerful ally, is now shifting her focus from the West to the opportunities of Asia-Pacific. Anglo-American policies that have been so closely intertwined for so long are now diverging. We British believe NATO is crucial to global security. President Trump is equivocal. We believe in free trade. America introduces tariffs. We support the Paris Climate Accords. America withdraws from them. We welcome China's Infrastructure Investment Bank. America holds itself away from it. We support the Iran nuclear deal. America rejects it and threatens sanctions on British and European companies if they trade with Iran. For the time being, and I hope only for the time being, British, European, and American views are diverging. I look forward to the day when once again we are at one. The most fundamental shift in power in the last half-century is the rise of China. In many ways, that is welcome. A Chinese economic giant in the East to match the American giant in the West will better balance the world economy. Together, those two countries are likely to shape the century to come. But as they do, the United Kingdom may no longer be part of a European political and trading bloc that can deal with both of them on a more or less equal basis. And that illustrates a new dilemma for our country. For decades, our overseas presence has been boosted by our close relationship with America and our membership of the European Union. On either side, we have had these economic and political giants. We were a more valued ally of America precisely because of our influence in Europe. And we were more valued by Europe precisely because of our close relationship with the United States. Now, America appears to be moving away from us at the same time as we are moving away from Europe. Lady Bracknell would regard that as very careless to lose both of those allies. And Britain, shorn of those long-standing allies, is suddenly seen by the world as a mid-size, middle-ranking power that is no longer supercharged by her alliances. And that will surely diminish our international and diplomatic influence. Now, don't misunderstand me. We will still matter. We're a proud and important nation with the fifth or sixth largest economy in the world. But we will matter a little less than once we did. Now, let me now turn to Brexit and the draft withdrawal deal. No one has yet had time to study the detail of its 500-plus pages. But that hasn't stopped committed Brexit supporters lining up to denounce it. And I can't say I'm surprised. A body of ultra-Brexiteers has always sought a complete break from Europe, and no compromise option, whatever it was ever likely to be acceptable to them. And Parliament now has essentially three choices: accept the Prime Minister's deal and go on to agree a trade deal during the transition period after March the 29th, or turn down, defeat the Prime Minister's negotiation and risk crashing out of the European Union with no deal at all, the so-called hard Brexit. Or thirdly, consider the possibility of a final binding referendum in which people vote on what the deal actually is and not the fantasy promises in the campaign of what the deal might have been. If Parliament so decided, the choice of remaining in the European Union could then be put on the ballot paper. Now, let me set out some considerations. What is the purpose of government? Together with the responsibility of keeping our people safe and free, the purpose of any government must be to improve our well-being collectively as a nation and as individuals. No dispassionate observer can deny that leaving the European Union will diminish our political influence and our role as an international power. Reality tells us that 65 million Britons can never carry the same influence as 500 million Europeans. But can leaving Europe without a deal, a hard Brexit, improve our economic competitiveness? Some people argue that yes, it can. I disagree. It seems to me it can only be true if we adopt policy decisions that will neither be wise nor acceptable to most opinion. Consider this. In theory, we could deregulate deeply to improve competitiveness, and it would have to be very deep. Now, some deregulation is desirable. We are overregulated. But our history suggests that a bonfire of controls sufficient to supercharge the economy would not be likely to last very long. At the first controversy brought about by deregulation, perhaps about the mis-selling of assets, or safety on the railway system, or fire cladding, there would be a public outcry and most likely a government retreat. We could, of course, offer state aids or hidden subsidies to boost our businesses. But that distortion of trade could be illegal under World Trade Organization rules, and in any event would cripple our legitimate criticism of those nations that do cheat on trade. Or we could cut taxes. That's always politically popular. We always want to cut taxes and boost spending without thinking quite how that magical trick is to be pulled off. So we could cut taxes and cut them especially desirably for low-paid workers. But deep reductions in revenue from tax cuts would be hard to implement while so many public services, from police to defence to health to social care to education to cyber protection to local councils, I could go on, are all crying out for more resources. The problem is that turning the UK into a pastiche of Singapore, the dream of some ultra-Brexiteers, will further divide a nation that at this moment needs not more division, but to be brought closer together. And it would hurt most those in our society who have least. Ultra-free market enthusiasts may applaud, but the poor would suffer. As a nation, do we want a low-wage economy? I don't think so. Do we want to lower social standards? No, again, certainly we do not. And for a government whose ambition is to reach out to those just about managing, such policies are surely impossible to reconcile. The facts suggest that far from improving our national wealth, leaving the European Union is overwhelmingly likely to reduce it. Because with the exception, the sole exception, of a small handful of economists philosophically committed to leaving Europe, every national and international economic body, including the International Monetary Fund, the Institute of Fiscal Studies, and our own government, have forecast that we will be worse off as a result of any conceivable form of Brexit. Register that. Worse off as a result of any conceivable form of Brexit. Now, if, longest preposition in the English language, but if those forecasts are correct, then for the first time in history, our nation will have instructed our government to make us poorer. No one, be they Remainer or Leaver, would, I think, have ever knowingly voted for that. My conclusion is that leaving Europe without a trade deal would be the worst of all options, and we should not accept that. No deal and a full departure from Europe raises some wider fears beyond trade. In 2014, Scotland voted against independence in a referendum, and a key factor in that decision was that the Scots wished to remain in the European Union. Had they left Britain, they would have been out of the European Union, they would have had to apply to join, they'd have had to join the back of a queue, they might have been out of Europe for a very long time, and as a smallish nation might not have got a very good deal. And they realized that, and they voted to remain in the United Kingdom. Now, having done that, and partly for that reason of remaining in Europe, they see their country about to be forcibly removed from Europe by the votes of the English and the Welsh. The time in Scotland is not yet ripe for another independence vote, but that time may come, and our British exodus from Europe heightens the risk of a Scottish exodus from the United Kingdom. And Northern Ireland, too, faces a future threat. As a whole, Northern Ireland voted to remain in the European Union. But the dominant party, the Democratic Unionist Party, are passionate leavers. After many years of bloodshed, the Good Friday Agreement in the 1990s ushered in 2 decades of peace, the like of which Northern Ireland had not seen for generations. In the 20 years since that, life in Northern Ireland has improved beyond any recognition for business and for the average family. But peace is never a done deal. Peace is never forever. And the Irish peace is still fragile. It still needs barriers to be lifted, old grudges to be forgiven, sectarian divides to be healed. For anyone who actually cares to study those divisions and study what happened in the years before the peace process, the question of a border between Northern Ireland and the South is not some tedious technicality frustrating the Brexit outcome. It is crucial to the lives and livelihoods of the people of Ireland, both north and south. If old divisions are rekindled, so too will be the demand for a border poll. And a few years beyond a bad Brexit, can anyone be truly confident that a border poll would not be demanded in Northern Ireland, granted, and deliver by the people's will a united Ireland? That is a risk a unionist should not take. So what then of the Prime Minister's deal? Of course, we don't yet know what it is, and it will be some time, I think, before all the details of it are examined and understood. At first glance, it provides some welcome relief. It protects frictionless trade, so utterly vital to business and industry, particularly perhaps small businesses. And it may well meet public concerns on issues such as immigration and net payments into the European budget. But it leaves the UK as a rule taker, with no influence over the rules and regulations made by the European Union. We must obey them, but we are not in a position to help negotiate them and protect ourselves from their impact if they are likely to cause particular difficulties for our industry. Now, that is not attractive, but it was always a likely consequence of leaving Europe while still wishing to trade with it. A look at Wales alone highlights a few of the issues of concern. In order to flourish, Cardiff, Newport, Swansea will need a good trade deal to secure their finance industry. Cardiff, for example, relies on financial services for around 80% of its services exports. Steel has always been important to Wales. At present, there is an excess of steel-making capacity in the world. Much of that is due to unfair trade, to unfair subsidies. Now, the UK alone is unlikely ever to be able to change that. But the European Union can, because of its size, and did last November, when they secured the agreement of steel-producing countries, including China and the United States, to move towards ending subsidies that distort and create unfair competition. And Welsh farmers may also face new challenges. At present, 70% of their food exports go to Europe without tariff, without non-tariff barriers. They are selling to Europe as if they were selling from Cardiff to Bristol. But if we leave the single market, that advantage will have gone. It will be lost. Beef exports could face, I don't know whether they will, but they could face formidable tariffs, as indeed could Wales's world-famous lamb. Moreover, if the UK reaches trade deals with America or Australia or New Zealand, which Brexit ministers confidently predict that they will, without putting a date to it, all British farmers are likely to face new and fierce price competition here in the home market. Farming will also lose European subsidies and, subject to decisions still to be taken, perhaps lose migrant labour as well. Now, replacement subsidies have been promised by the UK government for a brief time, but aren't guaranteed in the long term. And yet farmers need to be confident that future governments will continue to support them if cheap imports flow in to meet consumer demand. Now, that's a dipstick sample of the problems faced by farming, but there will be similar problems for every industry, whether an industry that produces goods or services. And practical concerns such as this will face nearly every sector of industry, commerce and farming until a trade deal is secured, which may take quite a long time. Now, I don't pretend to be neutral on the question of Europe. People who voted for Brexit did so with high hopes. They were promised we'd keep all the advantages of the single market. We won't. That we hold all the cards in negotiation, they now see plainly that we didn't. That we'd be better off as a nation and individuals, we emphatically will not. That we'd get cash back to fund the National Health Service, we won't. That the Irish border would present no problem, but it is, and it will. I could go on. The promises made that are going to be broken are many and varied. So what of the third option? Possibility of a new referendum in which remaining in the European Union is an option. It is a long chance. If the Prime Minister's deal is rejected and no deal is considered unthinkable by Parliament, that is a hard Brexit, as surely it must be, then voters may ask the question, why are we leaving at all? And if so, Parliament may offer them the opportunity to re-examine their choice, this time with all the facts behind them. I have heard Brexit supporters claim that such a further referendum would be a betrayal of the people. Others say ad nauseum, the people have decided, albeit on false premises, and therefore we must live with that decision. Slogans such as this, in such a complex debate, fall well below the level of response that is necessary. In the real world, not in the world of ideological squabbling, in the real world, if the facts change, and in this instance the facts have changed, people are entitled to change their minds. Many would argue that if promises have been made that can't be honoured, then it would be wrong to force a flawed Brexit through Parliament, a Brexit that no one voted for. Now let me illustrate that. Let me ask you a question. Would any of you take a job without knowing the salary or the working conditions? Most probably not. Would you buy a house without knowing the cost? Certainly not. Let me extend that analogy. In buying a house, you agree a price and then order a survey of the property. If the survey reveals wet rot, dry rot and subsidence, you withdraw from the sale. You buy or not on the basis of reality. And that, in a nutshell, is the case for a final and binding referendum. Would another referendum be difficult and controversial? Of course it would, inevitably so. The Brexiteers are certainly right about that. But it is an option that Parliament may not be able to ignore if it cannot reach a decision on how to proceed. Before we turn to questions, let me offer a final thought about the future. For many decades, I have watched as disputes over Europe have become increasingly poisonous. They have inflicted deep wounds on our political system, wounds that at some stage must be healed. It would be surely unforgivable if the legacy of Brexit were to be one of such bitterness and resentment that it closes down the normal avenues of parliamentary progress, and Parliament must use all its sovereign might and power to ensure that that does not happen. There should be no sympathy for personal posturing or political games. It is time for calm, reflective consideration of what in the long term will be the best outcome for the commerce and industry and people of our United Kingdom. And let us hope that on all sides, good sense will prevail. Thank you very much. Now, can I say something? Right, now I think it's your... Sorry, you carry on, after you.
We've got some time for questions. We had some questions in advance. I just want to call one of those questioners. Daniel Burton. Daniel from... Daniel, you're ranging a bit more widely, aren't you, Daniel, I think? Okay.
Before you ask your question, Daniel, let me make an offer to you all. You can ask almost any question you like. Almost any way you like, and I will answer it how I wish. Daniel, thank you.
What is your current stance on the ongoing North Korean peace talks, and how do you think they...
Sorry, I couldn't hear.
What is your current stance on the ongoing North Korean peace talks, and how do you think it will work moving forward?
Very interesting. What's my stance on the ongoing North Korean peace talks? Well, I'm not sure how much they're ongoing, Daniel, at the moment. It's extremely... A lot of promises were made by Kim Jong-un. Do feel free to sit. A lot of promises were made by Kim Jong-un. Some of them very attractive promises indeed, if they are kept. We had been here before. And I hope very much they will be kept, and I hope pressure will be kept upon North Korea to make them. It would make a world of difference if the Korean Peninsula could ensure peace. But I am a little sceptical about it. I just wonder to what extent China might have prevailed upon North Korea to be accommodating to America, because the very last thing China didn't want was for North Korea to continue its nuclear tests and have more American warships in the South China Sea. So I'm just a teeny bit, no real reason, just finger and feel, just a teeny bit suspicious of the speed and extent to which Kim Jong-un suddenly turned from an unbending, unyielding tyrant to a friendly would-be future Democrat keen to accommodate President Trump. So I will withhold judgment until he does dismantle a good deal of his nuclear capability, and until we do see that something practical is done to change the relationship inside North Korea, which is the last Stalinist outpost anywhere in the world. It is a ghastly place. If you lived in South Korea, you would find you were 2 or 3 inches taller than the people who lived in North Korea. That has a lot to do with their way of life, their diet, and the repression they face. It is truly an awful place. The sooner it is reformed, the better. If he's going to reform it, excellent. I'd much rather he reformed it. I'd be quite pleased if he stopped murdering his relatives. And it would be wonderful if we could see some progress. But I'm just a little unpersuaded at the moment.
Okay. Can I take two questions at a time, please? So, a show of hands who'd like to ask a question. Okay, I've got one there and Elizabeth there. Okay. There, please. And keep the questions nice and short as well, please.
My question is, with Brexit and with regards to the Windrush generation, do you think that young people will ever forgive the Tories?
So keep them short. Keep them mounted as well. I should have added. Elizabeth.
Hi, Elizabeth from MSc Global Governance. I'm a European Union student and I came here because it was very accessible because of European Union. Do you think Brexit will affect the influx of students and immigrants coming from European Union, and would that affect the economy? Thank you.
Okay.
Can I just take one more, Sir John?
Right. Okay. You stand the risk at my advanced years that I shall forget them.
Or that we get shorter answers.
Why, Sir John, at the last referendum, were the British citizens living in Europe or outside the borders of the UK not given a vote? They can in a general election, but they weren't for the referendum.
Let me take the questions in reverse order. I haven't the faintest idea where they weren't. I'm not in government. Had I been, I would have argued that they should have been. I think it was intolerable that they weren't given a vote. Had they done so, it might have changed the result. It was a very bad mistake, and it was also just plain wrong, in my view. But I can't tell you why that decision was made. As for, if I can, my long experience of politics suggests to me there is always one question too many, and he asked it. I hope you can mark him out as a troublemaker. I think it depends on what happens now. The majority of Brexiteers are, you're quite right, on the right wing of the Tory party, the very right wing of the Tory party. But they're not only there. You'll find them in other parties as well. But nonetheless, I think Brexit is now tied round the toes, the foot, the leg of the Conservative Party. And if it goes badly wrong, there will be a price to pay for it. But in politics, ever is a long time. And the one thing to boost the Conservative vote in history is to have a non-Conservative government. So if that happens at some stage, I'm sure forgiveness will appear. Elizabeth's question about the EU is one that concerns me a great deal. The extent to which immigration was used in the referendum campaign was pretty distasteful. It was a pretty ugly campaign, not least by UKIP in Wales, frankly, but elsewhere as well. And the fact of the matter is, when it actually comes to Europe, if I can restrict the answer as your question was to Europe, we would be in very real trouble without European migrants. A very fair proportion of the doctors and nurses in the National Health Service are European nurses. As you will know, in our modern age, at a certain age, it is compulsory to have a hip replacement. And because of that compulsion, I had one, naturally, being a good citizen. And of the 13 nurses that looked after me during the few days I was in hospital, 11 were European. And then, of course, there's the problem of social care. Social care, because we're all getting incredibly old, is growing exponentially. And every week, between now and 2030, we are going to need 1,300 new social care workers to look after our increasingly elderly population, about 200 a day. And a very large number of those have traditionally come from Europe. So either we're going to leave our elderly without proper care, or the present expectations on migration are going to have to change, and we are going to have to keep the door open to Europeans who offer skills like social care. Now, I think the attitude is changing. Reality is beginning to dawn, and I think there's a fair chance of a good outcome. There will be more migration control. That's plainly the wish of the public as a whole. And I think it will, well, I know a little of what is proposed, so I will shut up about what will. I think we are moving in the right direction on that front, and I very much hope so. As for students, it is stark staring bonkers not to let students in. Firstly, overseas students pay for their places, which is extremely useful. Secondly, having studied at a UK university, the vast majority of them become lifelong advocates for our country. And 20 or 30 years ahead, the student who leaves this university may be right at the top of their government machine in whichever country they've returned to. To throw away that asset is absolutely ludicrous. So I have high hopes that logic will prevail.
I suspect there's going to be a rush on this one, but I've got two more questions. I'm going to and there and a question there. I think that may...
Is that all? Oh, right.
Well, we'll see.
Good evening, Sir John. First of all, thank you very much for a very interesting and informative talk. You didn't mention, when you discussed the decline of the post-war institutions and liberal democracy, anything to do with the crash of 2008 and the encroachment of globalisation. Do you think that we have really got to grips with the devotion to markets and capitalism, and in particular the behaviour of the banks, that I think have caused much of the underlying problems that are driving this extremes in politics at the moment?
Yep.
Okay.
Supposing the scenario that actually does face us is that there cannot be any definite decision on how we go ahead now on joining Europe or not, and in fact we do have to have a second referendum, and let's suppose that then the majority wish to stay in Europe, what do you think the European Union attitude will be towards us, and do you think there will be any kind of punishment if that happened?
Yes, I saw an extremely stupid remark by the Budget Commissioner in Europe that was not only stupid, it was ill-informed. The fact of the matter is, if we haven't left Europe, they can't change the circumstances in which we decide not to leave Europe. So the chance of punishment changes in the nature of our relationship is something we needn't worry about. If we left and then applied to rejoin, it would be different. We wouldn't have the rebate. We wouldn't have the opt-out from the single currency, which I still think is in our interest. And we wouldn't have the opt-out from Schengen, which has clearly been in our interest. So there's a big advantage in making sure we don't actually leave until we are absolutely certain that we've got a deal that makes it credible for us to leave and credible for us to care for our own interests. But we are coming now to the crunch points of something extremely technical, extremely difficult, and absolutely crucial to our future. And that does tend to focus minds rather a lot. And I think minds are focusing now in a way they haven't in the past. And I draw some hope from that, but we will have to wait and see how things develop. Now, the question on capitalism and the crash of 2008. The crash of 2008 was due to bad capitalism. I believe in free markets. I believe in capitalism. I think it is infinitely better than any other system we've had. But that doesn't mean, if you believe in capitalism, that you should support people who distort capitalism and behave like bad capitalists. And we certainly shouldn't. One of the problems was that the banks were undercapitalized. That has pretty much been put right across Europe and in the United States. But the effect of that crash has been very wide-ranging. For every decade since the 1930s, at the end of the decade, the average family had been about 20% better off than they were at the beginning of the decade. In the last 10 years, since the 2007 crash, they are 1% better off. And that is only 1% because of the extent to which people at the bottom of the income, at the top of the income scale, have benefited. Many of the people at the bottom in America, in Europe, and here are still worse off than they were before 2007. And that is bad for the growth of extremism. It's bad for the sanity and safety of our political system. And it's just plain undesirable in every conceivable way you can think of. And we have to look at the things that went wrong in capitalism and try and put them right. And I've talked to a large number of very senior businessmen. They are well aware of that. It's quite noticeable, for example, the number of companies which have said, we will not pay the minimum wage, we'll do better, we'll pay the so-called living wage without any pressure from government to do it. Every businessman, every capitalist is not a wicked Victorian figure with a stovepipe hat grinding the poor into the ground. I mean, you hear about the bad employers, and we've had one or two in the last year getting a lot of publicity, but that isn't universal. And there is a need to cope with the bad hats, if I can use an old expression, and make sure the system works properly. What we can't afford is another 2007-2008 crash.
So, John, I know that we could take questions for a long time, and I am very sorry, but I do need to bring up Ian Price, who's the director of CBI Wales, who's our co-host for this evening, to give the vote of thanks.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
It's always difficult coming on to give a vote of thanks because you don't know what you're thanking before you come on. It's a bit like responding to the Chancellor's speech. I always feel sorry for the leader of the opposition. You must have done it a few times yourself, and it's a tough gig, isn't it? So anyway, but you made it quite easy tonight. Thank you very much, sir. And equally, thank you for coming on such a quiet news day. I've had about 5 requests to go on various media outlets today to comment on what's happened today with the deal. And I took a rather radical view. I decided to wait and read it before I commented on it. So, and I've noticed today there's been 24 hours of incessant news with lots of people commenting on the deal, not having seen it. And actually some people even suggesting they were going to vote against it without having seen it. So that's quite revolutionary. But anyway, thank you for coming along. There's a couple of things I wanted to thank you on. I wanted to thank you for not mentioning the backstop on the backstop, because I haven't got a clue what that is, and I'm sorry that you mentioned that. And the other thing that irritates me a little bit is the reference to the vassal state. And when you go back to London, can you mention to some of the politicians that we didn't all study history in Oxford? So if they could use a language that we all relate to and understand, that would be far better. But anyway. What's impressive about tonight is that it's quite clear that you speak a language that people understand, and there's not enough of that going on in politics at the moment. I think there are too many politicians talking to themselves and not enough politicians talking to us. And it's really refreshing tonight to listen to you speak, because you were talking to the audience, and a bit more of that we could all do with at the moment. I'm probably going to lose my job by saying some of this, but apologies. And interestingly enough, I had an email while I was sitting there telling me what I thought about the withdrawal deal, because we don't go out and say anything until we're told what we're supposed to say. So I've just had my email. So, and I know the lines for tomorrow. So. But as I say, what you've done tonight is restore our faith in politics. It's really impressive. You know, I was listening to every word you said. I agreed with 85% of it, which is quite rare when I listen to politicians these days. So that's quite an achievement. And I think equally as well, having listened to you speak tonight, it's a relief. Now, I would suggest you don't need to go on Strictly Come Dancing to retain your profile and credibility anytime soon, because you are worth listening to. So I just had one more question before I finish. And I'd like to thank the university for bringing you along this evening. Thank you for what you said. And my last question was, could you come back? Thank you very much.
Can I thank you all for making the time to be